Karoline Leavitt was not your typical guest on The View. She had made a name for herself as someone who didn't shy away from saying what others only thought. Her sharp tongue and bold opinions often stirred the pot, but they also earned her a loyal following. People admired her honesty, even if it sometimes came across as too blunt. That morning, as she stepped into the studio, no one could have guessed that this episode would become one of the most talked about moments in television history. The day started like any other. Karoline arrived early, carrying a cup of coffee and a notebook filled with scribbles. She always liked to prepare, jotting down key points she wanted to make during the show. As she settled into her chair, the energy in the room felt light and casual. The crew buzzed around, setting up microphones and adjusting lights. The other hosts exchanged pleasantries, chatting about their weekends and sharing jokes. It seemed like just another regular episode of The View, until it wasn't. As the countdown began for the live broadcast, Karoline took a deep breath. She knew the topics lined up for discussion: climate change, celebrity gossip, and summer. Fashion trends. None of these were particularly controversial, at least on the surface. But Karoline had been feeling restless lately. She often wondered why serious issues were treated so lightly on shows like this. Why did conversations about real problems always get overshadowed by fluff? Today, she decided, she wouldn't let that happen. When the cameras rolled and the opening segment kicked off, everything seemed normal. The hosts laughed and teased each other, setting the tone for a laid-back conversation. But as the discussion turned to climate change, something shifted. One of the co-hosts casually dismissed environmental activists as extreme, implying that their methods were over the top. Karoline's eyes narrowed slightly. She had heard this kind of dismissive comment before, and it always bothered her. This time, though, she wasn't going to stay quiet. Leaning forward in her chair, Karoline spoke up. At first, her tone was calm and measured. She acknowledged the importance of finding common ground, but quickly pivoted to a more serious note. "You know," she said, looking directly at the host who had made the comment, "it's easy to sit here in our comfortable chairs and label people as extreme when we're not the ones facing the consequences." The room grew quieter. The other hosts glanced at each other, unsure how to respond. Karoline continued, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "These aren't just activists. These are people fighting for their lives, for their homes, their families, their futures. And calling them extreme? That's not fair." Her words hung in the air, cutting through the usual banter. For a moment, it felt like everyone held their breath. Then one of the co-hosts tried to lighten the mood. "Well, let's not get too doom and gloom here," she joked nervously. But Karoline wasn't having it. She leaned even closer to the table, her expression intense. "This isn't doom and gloom," she shot back, her voice rising slightly. "This is reality. And if talking about reality makes me too intense for your show, then maybe your show doesn't deserve to exist." The room froze. No one moved. Even the audience, usually quick to applaud or laugh, sat in stunned silence. Backstage, the control room erupted into chaos. Producers whispered urgently into their headsets, trying to figure out what to do next. The tension in the studio was thick enough to cut with a knife. For a split second, it felt like time had stopped. The co-host, who had tried to lighten the mood with her doom and gloom comment, now looked unsure of what to say next. Her smile faltered, and she glanced at the others for support, but no one jumped in to rescue her. Instead, all eyes were on Karoline, whose unwavering gaze seemed to pierce through the awkward silence. Backstage, the producer frantically signaled for a commercial break. He gestured wildly, mouthing the words, "Cut! Cut!" But the director hesitated. They were live, after all, and cutting away mid-conversation could make things worse. Millions of viewers were watching, and pulling the plug would only fuel speculation. Finally, someone hit the button, and the screen faded to a glossy ad for laundry detergent. But even as the cameras turned off, the energy in the room didn't shift. The hosts exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves. One of them muttered something about staying neutral, while another shook her head, clearly unsettled. Meanwhile, the audience sat frozen, unsure whether to clap or stay quiet. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, eager to see what would happen next. Karoline, however, remained unfazed. She sat upright, in her chair, her hands resting calmly on the table. When the producer rushed over to pull her aside, his face flushed with frustration, she met him with a cool, steady look. "What were you thinking?" he hissed under his breath, trying to keep his voice low so the mics wouldn't pick it up. "You can't just drop bombs like that on live TV." Karoline crossed her arms and tilted her head slightly, her expression unapologetic. "Why not?" she replied, her tone calm but firm. "Because it makes people uncomfortable? Good. Maybe they need to feel uncomfortable." The producer stared at her, momentarily speechless. He opened his mouth to argue but quickly realized there was no point. Karoline wasn't going to back down, and deep down, he knew it. With a sigh, he muttered something about damage control and hurried back to the control room, leaving her standing alone by the table. When the show returned from the commercial break, the atmosphere had changed completely. The lighthearted banter was gone, replaced by an almost palpable sense of caution. The hosts tried their best to move on to the next topic, celebrity gossip, but it was clear they were walking on eggshells. They laughed a little too loudly, at each other's jokes, and avoided making eye contact with Karoline altogether. It didn't take long for her to interrupt again. As they discussed a famous actor's recent breakup, Karoline leaned forward, her voice cutting through the shallow chatter like a knife. "Let's talk about what really matters," she said, addressing the camera directly. Her tone was sharp but sincere, commanding attention. "While we're obsessing over who's dating whom, there are children going hungry, families losing everything to natural disasters, and politicians doing absolutely nothing about it. Is this really the best use of our time?" The room went silent once more. Even the audience seemed unsure how to react. A few hesitant claps broke out, but most people simply stared, caught between admiration and disbelief. Backstage, the control room buzzed with panicked whispers. One of the executives grabbed the producer by the arm and demanded to know what was being done to fix the situation. "We can't have her hijacking the show like this," he snapped. "Do something." But what could they do? Cutting to another commercial felt too obvious, and trying to shut Karoline down on live TV would only make things worse. The team debated furiously, weighing their options. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the head producer made the call. Cut to black. End the show. And just like that, The View abruptly ended its broadcast, leaving viewers stunned. Screens across the country flickered to black, accompanied by confused murmurs and exclamations of surprise. Social media exploded within seconds. Clips of Karoline's fiery remarks began circulating online, sparking heated debates. Some praised her for speaking truth to power, while others criticized her for being too confrontational. Either way, everyone was talking, and that was exactly what Karoline had hoped for. As the credits rolled prematurely, the studio descended into controlled chaos. The hosts quickly wrapped up their goodbyes, though it was clear none of them knew quite what to say. Karoline stood up from her chair, her expression unreadable. She didn't apologize or try to explain herself further. Instead, she walked straight out of the studio, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and lingering tension. Outside, reporters swarmed the building, eager to get a statement. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust toward her as she stepped into the bright sunlight. For a moment she paused, shielding her eyes from the glare. Then, without saying a word, she climbed into a waiting car and drove off, leaving the media circus behind. Back inside the studio, the aftermath was chaotic. Producers huddled in meetings, trying to figure out how to handle the fallout. Advertisers called in, demanding answers. Executives paced nervously, torn between defending the show's reputation and acknowledging the power of Karoline's message. It was clear that this incident would have lasting repercussions, not just for The View, but for Karoline herself. Little did anyone know, this was only the beginning. The hours following the abrupt end of The View felt like a whirlwind. Social media was ablaze with reactions, and news outlets scrambled to cover the story. Clips of Karoline's passionate outburst were everywhere, on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and every major news website. People couldn't stop talking about it. Some called her a hero for daring to speak the truth, while others labeled her reckless and unprofessional. The divide was sharp, but one thing was undeniable. Karoline had struck a nerve. For Karoline, though, the chaos outside was nothing compared to what she was feeling inside. As she sat in her car, driving away from the studio, her mind raced. She replayed the events over and over again, wondering if she had gone too far. Sure, she meant every word she said, but now that the moment had passed, doubt crept in. Was this the end of her career? Would she be blacklisted from mainstream media forever? She pulled over at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, needing a break from the noise. Ordering a strong cup of coffee, she found a corner seat and stared out the window. Her phone buzzed nonstop with notifications, but she ignored it for now. This wasn't the time to get caught up in the online frenzy. Instead, she focused on why she had spoken up in the first place. Karoline had always believed in using her platform to shine a light on issues that mattered. Growing up, she'd seen firsthand how easily people could turn a blind eye to suffering when it didn't directly affect them. Whether it was climate disasters or social injustices, the world often seemed content to sweep big problems under the rug as long as life carried on comfortably for the privileged few. That morning on The View, she hadn't planned to explode like that, it just happened. But deep down, she knew it came from a place of frustration. Frustration with the way serious topics were treated as afterthoughts. Frustration with the constant pressure to water down her opinions, and frustration with herself for staying silent for so long. Back at the studio, things weren't much calmer. The production team huddled in a conference room, trying to figure out their next move. One of the executives paced back and forth, his face red with stress. "We can't let this slide," he said, slamming his hand on the table. "If we don't address this properly, we'll lose advertisers and, worse, credibility." Others nodded in agreement, but no one had a clear solution. Should they issue an apology, release a statement defending free speech, or simply pretend the whole thing never happened? Meanwhile, the hosts were dealing with their own mix of emotions. Some felt betrayed by Karoline's outburst, believing she had disrespected the show and its audience. Others secretly admired her courage, even if they didn't agree with everything she said. They gathered in the green room, whispering among themselves. One host sighed heavily and said, "I just hope this blows over soon. I don't think I've ever been part of something so explosive." As the day wore on, the public reaction only grew louder. Supporters of Karoline flooded social media with hashtags like "Stand with Karoline" and "Speak Your Truth." Many praised her for refusing to play along with what they saw as shallow entertainment, disguised as meaningful discussion. Finally, someone said what we've all been thinking. One fan tweeted. Another wrote, "If being too intense means caring about real issues, then count me in." Critics, however, were quick to slam her. Commentators on conservative talk shows accused her of hijacking the program for personal gain. "This isn't journalism, it's grandstanding," one pundit declared. Others argued that while her points might have merit, her delivery was unnecessarily confrontational. "You can care about important issues without alienating half your audience," a columnist wrote. Amidst the polarized responses, one question kept coming up. What would happen to Karoline now? Rumors swirled about her future in media. Would the network ban her from appearing on any of their programs? Could she recover from such a bold move? Despite the uncertainty, Karoline refused to let fear dictate her next steps. By evening, she decided it was time to face the music. Sitting in her apartment, she turned on her laptop and opened a blank document. For the next hour, she poured her thoughts onto the screen, crafting a heartfelt message to share with her followers. When she finally posted it on Instagram, the response was overwhelming. "I didn't come here to sugarcoat the truth," she wrote. "Yes, I spoke my mind today, and yes, it got messy. But I stand by what I said because these are conversations we need to have. If my honesty cost me opportunities, so be it. At least I'll know I stayed true to myself. Her post went viral, almost instantly. Fans flooded the comment section with messages of support, calling her brave and inspiring. Even some critics softened their stance, admitting that her words had made them think twice about the issues she raised. It was clear that Karoline's actions had sparked something bigger than anyone anticipated, a national conversation about authenticity, accountability, and the role of media in addressing real-world problems. But the fallout wasn't just limited to social media. Over the next few days, late-night talk shows invited her to appear as a guest. Journalists reached out for interviews, eager to hear her side of the story. Advertisers who worked with The View expressed mixed feelings, unsure whether to distance themselves from the controversy or capitalize on the attention. Behind closed doors, executives debated whether to renew Karoline's contract. In the end, the decision came down to protecting the show's image. They opted not to bring her back, citing concerns about maintaining a balanced tone. Though it stung to receive the news, Karoline took it in stride. She knew standing up for her beliefs came with risks, and losing access to mainstream platforms was one of them. But instead of seeing it as a defeat, she viewed it as an opportunity. If traditional media wouldn't give her the space to speak freely, she'd create her own platform. With newfound determination, Karoline began planning her next chapter. She envisioned a podcast where she could tackle hard-hitting topics without filters or restrictions. Something raw, honest, and unapologetic. Something that gave a voice to the voiceless. Little did she know, this decision would change her life, and the lives of countless listeners, in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Karoline wasted no time in turning her setback into a stepping stone. Within days of the View fallout, she began working on her podcast idea with a level of energy that surprised even herself. She rented a small studio space downtown, painted the walls a calming shade of blue, and filled the room with cozy furniture to make it feel inviting. A microphone stood at the center of the table, surrounded by notebooks, highlighters, and a stack of books about everything from climate change to social justice. This was her new home, a place where she could say exactly what she wanted without worrying about cutting comments or awkward silences. Her first task was figuring out what to call the show. After hours of brainstorming, she landed on Unfiltered. And it wasn't flashy or overly clever, but it fit perfectly. The name said everything. This would be a space for real conversations, no sugarcoating, no holding back. Her goal was simple: to amplify voices that mattered and tackle issues people often avoided talking about. She didn't care if it ruffled feathers. In fact, she hoped it would. To get things rolling, Karoline reached out to a few friends who worked in media production. One of them agreed to help edit episodes, while another offered advice on how to grow an audience online. They warned her that starting a podcast wouldn't be easy. It took time, patience, and consistency. But Karoline didn't mind putting in the work. For her, this wasn't just a career move. It was personal. Every episode would carry a piece of her heart, a reflection of why she got into this line of work in the first place. The debut episode aired 2 weeks after the infamous View incident. Titled Why I Spoke Up, it opened with Karoline sitting alone in the studio, speaking directly into the mic. Her voice was steady but warm, almost like she was having a one-on-one conversation with each listener. "I'm not here to apologize for what happened," she began, leaning closer to the microphone. "Some people think I crossed a line, and maybe I did. But you know what? Lines are meant to be questioned. If staying quiet means ignoring the truth, then I'll cross that line every single time." She went on to explain her thoughts about the state of media today. How so many shows prioritize entertainment over education. How serious topics are often reduced to sound bites, and how audiences are left feeling informed when really, they've only scratched the surface. By the end of the episode, listeners weren't just hearing her story. They were nodding along, agreeing with her frustrations, and sharing their own experiences in the comments section. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, downloads started pouring in. Fans praised the raw honesty of her words, saying it felt refreshing to hear someone speak without fear of backlash. Critics predictably accused her of being self-righteous, But even they couldn't deny the power of her delivery. More importantly, advertisers began reaching out, intrigued by the buzz surrounding her launch. Companies that aligned with her values saw an opportunity to support meaningful content, and before long, Unfiltered Truth had its first sponsor. As the weeks went by, Karoline kept pushing boundaries. Each episode tackled a different topic, ranging from environmental activism to mental health awareness. She invited guests onto the show, scientists, teachers, activists, and everyday people with powerful stories to tell. Unlike other interview-style podcasts, hers wasn't scripted or polished. Conversations flowed naturally, sometimes getting heated, sometimes emotional, but always authentic. Listeners loved it. They felt like they were part of something bigger, a movement fueled by genuine connection rather than empty rhetoric. One particularly memorable episode featured a young woman who had lost her family home to a wildfire. Her voice trembled as she described watching flames engulf the house where she grew up. "It's not just wood and bricks," she said, tears streaming down her face. "It's memories. It's everything." Karoline listened intently, giving her space to share her pain without interruption. When the guest finished speaking, Karoline simply said, "Thank you for sharing your truth with us. We owe it to you, and to everyone affected by these disasters, to do better." That moment struck a chord with listeners. Reviews poured in, calling the episode heartbreaking yet hopeful and a wake-up call we all needed. It became the most downloaded episode of the season, catapulting Unfiltered Truth to the top of the charts. Suddenly, Karoline wasn't just a former talk show guest making waves. She was a force to be reckoned with. Despite her growing success, Karoline stayed grounded. She spent hours responding to messages from fans, thanking them for their support and listening to their feedback. Many wrote to say her podcast had inspired them to take action in their communities, whether it was volunteering at local shelters or organizing fundraisers for disaster relief. Others shared how her words gave them courage to speak up about issues they'd been too afraid to address. Reading those notes reminded Karoline why she started this journey in the first place. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. There were days when the pressure felt overwhelming. Some nights she lay awake wondering if she was doing enough, if her voice truly made a difference. And then there were the trolls, the anonymous accounts hurling insults and threats, trying to bring her down. At first it bothered her, but eventually she learned to tune them out. "If they're mad, I must be doing something right," she joked during one episode, laughing off the negativity. By the third month, Unfiltered Truth had become a cultural phenomenon. Schools began assigning episodes as listening material for class discussions. Community groups used the podcast as a springboard for organizing events around social causes. Even late-night hosts referenced her work, jokingly referring to her as the woman who ended The View but saved podcasting. Through it all, Karoline remained humble. In interviews, she credited her success to the listeners who showed up, week after week, eager to engage with tough topics. "This isn't my show," she told one reporter. "It belongs to everyone who cares enough to listen, to learn, and to act. I'm just the person holding the mic." What started as a bold leap into the unknown had transformed into something far greater than Karoline ever imagined. She hadn't just created a podcast, she had built a community. And as she sat in her little blue-walled studio, preparing for the next episode, she knew this was only the beginning. As Unfiltered Truth gained momentum, Karoline's life began to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. The podcast wasn't just a platform anymore, it was a movement. People from all walks of life reached out to her, sharing their stories, and asking for advice on how they could make a difference. Some were activists looking for guidance, while others were ordinary folks who simply wanted to understand the issues better. Karoline found herself at the center of something much bigger than herself, and though it was exhilarating, it also came with its own set of challenges. One day, after recording an episode about affordable housing, Karoline received an email that stopped her in her tracks. It was from a single mother living in a cramped apartment with her 2 kids. She wrote about how rising rents had forced them to move 3 times in the past year, each time landing in worse conditions. "I work full-time," she explained. "But no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to get ahead. My kids deserve better, but I don't know what to do." Karoline read the message several times, her heart heavy with emotion. Stories like this weren't new to her. She'd heard countless versions during her research, but something about this particular email struck a nerve. Maybe it was the raw honesty, or maybe it was the way the woman refused to give up despite everything stacked against her. Whatever it was, Karoline knew she couldn't ignore it. She decided to dedicate an entire episode to the issue of affordable housing, using the woman's story as a starting point. She invited experts onto the show, a policy analyst, a social worker, and a tenant rights advocate, to break down why so many families were struggling to find stable homes. But more importantly, she made sure the woman herself was part of the conversation. With permission, Karoline shared excerpts from her email and then brought her on as a guest via phone call. The episode aired on a Tuesday afternoon, and by Wednesday morning, it had gone viral. Listeners praised Karoline for giving a voice to someone who might otherwise have been overlooked. Many donated to organizations working to combat homelessness, while others volunteered their time to local shelters. One listener even offered to help the woman directly, connecting her with resources in her area. For Karoline, moments like these reinforced why she did what she did. This wasn't just about raising awareness, it was about creating real change. But not every episode went smoothly. There were times when conversations turned heated, especially when tackling divisive topics like healthcare reform or education, inequality. During one particularly intense discussion about student loan debt, one of her guests clashed with another over proposed solutions. Voices rose, tempers flared, and for a moment, it seemed like the debate might spiral out of control. Karoline intervened calmly, reminding everyone that disagreement was okay, as long as it stayed respectful. "It's okay to see things differently," she said, her tone firm but kind. "In fact, we need those differences if we want to find real solutions. But let's focus on listening to each other instead of talking over each other." Her ability to mediate tough conversations earned her praise from both guests and listeners alike. People appreciated that she didn't shy away from difficult discussions but also ensured they remained productive. Slowly but surely, unfiltered truth became known as a safe space for uncomfortable truths, a place where people could come together, even if they didn't always agree. Despite her growing influence, Karoline never lost sight of her roots. She still spent hours researching topics, reading articles, and reaching out to experts to ensure she was well informed before diving into any subject. Her preparation paid off. Listeners trusted her because they knew she cared deeply about getting the facts right. And when she didn't have all the answers, which happened more often than she liked to admit, she admitted it openly, encouraging her audience to seek out information themselves. Her authenticity resonated with younger audiences in particular. Teenagers and college students began tuning in regularly, drawn to her unapologetic approach and willingness to tackle issues affecting their generation. Climate change, mental health, racial injustice, these were topics they cared about deeply, and hearing someone speak candidly about them felt validating. Many started writing essays inspired by her episodes, while others organized protests or fundraisers based on ideas sparked by her conversations. One high school teacher wrote to thank Karoline for inspiring her students. "They've become more engaged in class discussions," she said. "Your podcast has taught them that it's okay to ask questions, challenge assumptions, and stand up for what they believe in. You're making a difference in ways you probably don't even realize." Reading messages like this filled Karoline with gratitude but also a sense of responsibility. She knew she had a unique opportunity to shape minds and spark action, and she didn't take it lightly. Every decision she made, from the topics she covered to the guests she invited, was guided by one question: will this help someone? If the answer was yes, she moved forward without hesitation. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm her. Late nights spent editing episodes left her exhausted, and the constant pressure to stay relevant weighed heavily on her shoulders. Sometimes she wondered if she was doing enough, if her efforts were truly making a dent in the massive problems facing society. On those days, she reminded herself of the woman who wrote about her struggles with affordable housing, the teenager who organized a climate march, and the countless others whose lives had been touched by her work. Their stories kept her going. By the 6th month of Unfiltered Truth, Karoline's impact extended far beyond the podcast itself. She partnered with nonprofits to host community events, bringing together activists, educators, and everyday citizens to brainstorm solutions to pressing issues. These gatherings weren't just talk. They led to tangible outcomes like petition drives and grassroots campaigns aimed at driving systemic change. Through it all, Karoline remained grounded, choosing to celebrate small victories rather than obsessing over perfection. When a fan told her that her podcast had changed their perspective on an issue, she smiled knowing she'd done her job. And when critics accused her of being too idealistic, she shrugged it off, saying, "If dreaming of a better world makes me unrealistic, then call me a dreamer." For Karoline, the journey was far from over. Each episode brought new challenges, new insights, and new opportunities to connect with people who shared her passion for justice and truth. As she sat in her studio, headphones on and microphone ready, she felt a deep sense of purpose. This wasn't just a career, it was a calling, and she was just getting started. By the time Unfiltered Truth hit its 1-year anniversary, Karoline had become more than just a podcaster. She was a symbol of resistance against apathy. Her voice carried weight not because it was loud or aggressive, but because it was real. People trusted her to tell it like it is, even when the truth wasn't pretty. But with that trust came expectations, and those expectations weren't always easy to meet. The turning point came during an episode about systemic racism in education. Karoline had spent weeks preparing for this topic, reading books, watching documentaries, and consulting experts. She wanted to get it right, not just for her audience, but for herself. Growing up, she'd seen how unequal opportunities could shape lives, including her own. This was personal. The episode featured 2 guests, a high school teacher who worked in underserved communities and a policy advocate fighting for equitable funding in schools. As they spoke, their stories painted a heartbreaking picture of broken systems and forgotten children. The teacher described classrooms so overcrowded that students had to share textbooks. The advocate talked about how decades of neglect had left generations without access to quality education. Karoline listened intently, nodding along as tears welled up in her eyes. When it was her turn to speak, her voice trembled slightly. "I don't know what the perfect solution is," she admitted, "but I do know that ignoring the problem isn't working. We can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's clearly not." Her vulnerability struck a chord with listeners. After the episode aired, emails poured in from teachers, parents, and students sharing their experiences. Many thanked her for shining a light on an issue that often went unnoticed. Others offered solutions, ranging from grassroots initiatives to policy changes. One listener suggested starting a mentorship program to connect college students with younger kids in struggling neighborhoods. Another proposed organizing fundraisers to buy supplies for underfunded schools. Inspired by these ideas, Karoline decided to take action. She announced a special series called Building Bridges, where she would highlight practical steps people could take to address systemic issues. Each episode focused on a different area: education, healthcare, criminal justice reform, and ended with actionable advice for listeners. For example, after the education episode, she encouraged her audience to volunteer at local schools, write letters to lawmakers, or donate to organizations working to close the opportunity gap. The response was overwhelming. Teachers received boxes of donated supplies. Lawmakers reported spikes in calls and emails urging them to prioritize education funding. Even small acts, like tutoring sessions organized by college students, made a difference in kids' lives. Karoline watched it all unfold with a mix of pride and awe. What started as a single podcast episode had turned into a ripple effect of kindness and activism. But not everyone was thrilled with her growing influence. Critics accused her of oversimplifying complex problems or pushing agendas disguised as solutions. Some argued that her focus on individual actions ignored the need for large-scale structural change. While Karoline understood their concerns, she refused to let negativity derail her mission. If waiting for perfect solutions means doing nothing in the meantime, then we'll never make progress, she said during a live Q&A session. Yes, big changes are needed, but that doesn't mean we should sit around twiddling our thumbs until they happen. Every little bit counts. Her optimism resonated with many, especially young people eager to make a difference. College campuses across the country began hosting unfiltered action events inspired by her podcast. Students gathered to discuss social issues, brainstorm solutions, and implement projects in their communities. One group launched a campaign to provide free menstrual products in public schools, while another set up workshops to teach digital literacy skills to seniors. Even celebrities took notice. A popular actress shared an episode on Instagram, praising Karoline for tackling tough topics with grace and courage. Soon after, donations to the nonprofits Karoline supported skyrocketed. Brands approached her for partnerships, offering to sponsor episodes or collaborate on awareness campaigns. At first, she hesitated. She didn't want to lose control over her message, but ultimately, she agreed to work with companies whose values aligned with hers. Together, they created content that educated and inspired audiences worldwide. Despite her success, Karoline remained humble. She often reminded herself and her listeners that she was still learning. During one episode, she opened up about a mistake she'd made early in her career. "I once dismissed someone's perspective because I thought I knew better," she confessed. "Looking back, I realize how wrong I was. Growth happens when you listen, not when you talk." Her honesty only deepened her connection with her audience. They saw her as human, flaws and all, which made her relatable. Listeners felt comfortable sharing their own struggles and triumphs, knowing she wouldn't judge them. Over time, unfiltered, truth became less about Karoline and more about the collective effort to create positive change. As the second year of the podcast approached, Karoline reflected on how far she'd come, from being labeled too intense on national television to building a global community of changemakers. Her journey had been anything but predictable, yet through every challenge and victory, one thing remained constant: her belief in the power of truth. "I didn't start this podcast thinking I'd change the world," she said in a heartfelt anniversary episode. "I just wanted to have honest conversations about things that matter." But somewhere along the way, those conversations sparked something bigger, a movement fueled by hope, determination, and a refusal to stay silent. She paused, smiling softly before adding, "And honestly, that's the best outcome I could have ever hoped for." For Karoline, the road ahead was uncertain, but she welcomed it with open arms. Every day brought new challenges, new stories, and new opportunities to inspire action. And as long as there were truths worth telling, she knew she'd keep showing up, for herself, for her listeners, and for the world they were trying to build together. As Unfiltered Truth entered its third year, Karoline found herself at a crossroads. The podcast had grown beyond anything she could have imagined, but with that growth came new questions. How much further could she push the boundaries? Was it possible to keep challenging the status quo without burning out? And most importantly, how could she ensure her message continued to resonate in a world that seemed increasingly divided? The answer came unexpectedly during a visit to a small town in the Midwest. Karoline had been invited to speak at a community event organized by local activists who had been inspired by her work. It was nothing fancy, just a gathering in a church basement, but the energy in the room was electric. People of all ages sat shoulder to shoulder, eager to hear what she had to say. When it was her turn to speak, Karoline stepped up to the mic and smiled warmly. "I didn't come here to tell you what to think," she began, her voice steady yet inviting. "I came here because I want to listen." For the next hour, she opened the floor to anyone who wanted to share their thoughts or concerns. What followed was one of the most powerful conversations she'd ever experienced. A farmer spoke about the challenges of adapting to climate change while trying to make ends meet. A retired teacher shared her worries about the future of public education. A young mother talked about the difficulty of finding affordable childcare. Each story was unique, yet they all pointed to the same underlying issue. People were struggling, and they felt unheard. Karoline left that evening with a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that while her podcast gave her a platform to amplify important voices, there was still so much more to be done. Listening wasn't enough. She needed to find ways to bring people together, to bridge the gaps between communities, ideologies, and experiences. Back home, she launched a new initiative called Truth in Action. The idea was simple. Instead of just talking about problems, on the podcast, she would actively work to address them alongside her listeners. Every month, she chose a different cause to focus on, whether it was planting trees to combat deforestation or raising funds for families affected by natural disasters. She encouraged her audience to join her, whether through volunteering, donating, or simply spreading awareness. The response was incredible. Thousands of people signed up to participate, forming teams in cities across the country. In Chicago, volunteers cleaned up parks and planted gardens. In Los Angeles, they organized workshops to teach financial literacy skills to low-income families. In rural areas, they delivered food and supplies to isolated communities. Karoline traveled whenever she could, meeting participants and documenting their efforts for the podcast. One project stood out in particular, a nationwide campaign to support frontline workers during flu season. Hospitals and clinics were overwhelmed, and many staff members were working long hours without proper rest or resources. Karoline partnered with several organizations to provide care packages filled with snacks, hand creams, and handwritten notes of gratitude. Listeners donated money, sewed masks, and even baked cookies to include in the packages. When the first batch of care packages arrived at a hospital in New York City, Karoline received a video from the staff thanking her and her team. Their smiles said it all. One nurse held up a note written by a child and read it aloud. "Thank you for helping us stay healthy. You're my hero." Watching the clip brought tears to Karoline's eyes. Moments like these reminded her why she kept going. Even when the work felt overwhelming, the impact made it worthwhile. Of course, not everything went smoothly. There were logistical challenges, disagreements over priorities, and moments of doubt when Karoline wondered if she was biting off more than she could chew. But every time she considered scaling back, she thought about the faces of the people she'd met, the farmer, the teacher, the nurse, and knew she couldn't stop. Now, her persistence paid off in unexpected ways. Media outlets began covering Truth in Action, highlighting its grassroots approach to solving real-world problems. Celebrities joined the movement, using their platforms to amplify its reach. Even politicians took notice, citing Karoline's initiatives as examples of effective community-driven solutions. Through it all, Karoline stayed true to her roots. She continued hosting Unfiltered Truth, ensuring that each episode balanced hard-hitting discussions with moments of hope and inspiration. Her guests ranged from everyday heroes making a difference in their neighborhoods to global leaders tackling large-scale issues. No matter who sat across from her, she treated them with the same respect and curiosity that had defined her style from the beginning. By the end of the third year, Karoline's influence extended far beyond the podcast. She had become a trusted voice, not just for her opinions, but for her ability to unite people around shared goals. Schools started teaching lessons based on her episodes. Businesses adopted sustainable practices inspired by her campaigns, and individuals found courage to take action in their own lives. Looking back, Karoline marveled at how far she'd come since that fateful day on The View. Back then, she never imagined speaking her mind would lead to such profound changes in her life and in the lives of others. But now, she understood that truth has a way of creating ripples that spread farther than we can see. "I used to think my job was to speak up," she reflected during a live recording celebrating the podcast's anniversary. "But now I realize it's bigger than that. My job is to remind people that their voices matter too. Together, we can create a world where no one feels invisible. As the applause faded and the lights dimmed, Karoline packed up her things and headed home. Tomorrow would bring another episode, another challenge, another chance to make a difference. And though she didn't know exactly what lay ahead, one thing was certain: she would keep showing up, for her listeners, for her community, and for the truth. Because in the end, that's what mattered most. As the fourth year of Unfiltered Truth rolled around, Karoline faced a new kind of challenge, one that came from within. For so long, she had poured every ounce of her energy into the podcast and her initiatives, driven by an unrelenting desire to make a difference. But now, for the first time, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. The late nights, the endless planning, the emotional toll of hearing heartbreaking stories, it was starting to catch up with her. One morning, after a particularly grueling week of recording episodes and organizing community projects, Karoline woke up feeling unusually drained. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts about deadlines, meetings, and unanswered emails. For a moment, she considered skipping her usual routine and staying in bed all day. But then she remembered something her grandmother used to say: "You can't pour from an empty cup." That phrase stuck with her throughout the day. Later that evening, as she sat in her studio reviewing notes for the next episode, she paused and took a deep breath. Maybe it was time to slow down, not stop, but recalibrate. After all, how could she continue inspiring others if she wasn't taking care of herself? The next week, Karoline made a bold decision. She announced a short hiatus from the podcast, a month-long break to recharge and reflect. Her announcement shocked some listeners, who had grown accustomed to her relentless pace. Others applauded her honesty, saying they admired her willingness to prioritize self-care. Either way, the response proved one thing: people cared deeply about her well-being. During her break, Karoline did something she hadn't done in years. Nothing. Well, almost nothing. She spent her days walking in the park, reading books purely for pleasure, and reconnecting with old friends over coffee. At first, it felt strange to step away from the constant hustle, but soon she found herself enjoying the quiet moments. It gave her space to think about what truly mattered and what didn't. One afternoon, while sitting on a bench overlooking a lake, she jotted down some ideas in her notebook. What if Unfiltered Truth evolved again? What if it became less about her and more about empowering others to share their own truths? The thought excited her. She envisioned creating a platform where everyday people could record their own mini-episodes, sharing their experiences and insights with the world. It wouldn't replace the main show, but it would complement it, a way to amplify even more voices. When she returned from her break, Karoline wasted no time putting her idea into motion. She called it Your Truth, a spin-off series featuring guest hosts from diverse backgrounds. Each episode focused on a personal story or perspective, giving listeners a glimpse into lives vastly different from their own. From a single father raising his kids alone to a former inmate rebuilding his life after prison, the stories were raw, honest, and deeply moving. The first episode featured a young woman who had overcome homelessness. Her voice trembled as she recounted sleeping in bus stations and relying on strangers' kindness to survive. But there was also strength in her words, a determination to turn her pain into purpose. By the end of the episode, she urged listeners to look beyond stereotypes and see the humanity in everyone. The feedback was overwhelming. People praised Karoline for stepping aside and letting others shine. Many said, Your Truth inspired them to reflect on their own journeys and consider how they could contribute to making the world a better place. Some even reached out asking to be part of future episodes, eager to share their own stories. With Your Truth gaining traction, Karoline decided to expand her reach even further. She partnered with schools, libraries, and community centers to host storytelling workshops. Participants learned how to craft compelling narratives and use their voices effectively. For many, it was a transformative experience, an opportunity to reclaim their agency and connect with others through shared experiences. But Karoline didn't stop there. Inspired by the success of Your Truth, She launched another initiative called Truth Talks. These were live events held in cities across the country, bringing together activists, artists, and everyday citizens to discuss pressing issues. Unlike traditional panel discussions, these events encouraged audience participation, fostering meaningful dialogue between speakers and attendees. At one Truth Talks event in Atlanta, a local artist showcased a mural he'd created to honor victims of gun violence. As he explained the symbolism behind each element of the painting, the crowd listened intently, moved by both his artistry and his message. Another speaker, a teenage climate activist, spoke passionately about the importance of holding corporations accountable for environmental harm. When the floor opened for questions, hands shot up immediately, sparking lively debates and thoughtful exchanges. These events reminded Karoline of why she started this journey in the first place: to create spaces where people could come together, listen, and learn. And while she still hosted episodes of Unfiltered Truth, she found joy in watching others take center stage. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about building a movement rooted in authenticity and empathy. As the months went by, Karoline noticed subtle shifts, not just in her work, but in herself. She felt lighter, freer, more grounded. Taking that break had taught her the value of balance, and she carried that lesson into everything she did. Whether it was mentoring young creators, collaborating with nonprofits, or simply spending time with loved ones, she approached life with a renewed sense of gratitude. By the end of the 4th year, Karoline's impact was undeniable. Unfiltered Truth remained a staple for anyone seeking honest conversations about tough topics. Your truth continued to uplift marginalized voices, proving that everyone has a story worth telling. And Truth Talks brought communities closer, fostering connections that transcended differences. Reflecting on her journey, Karoline realized that the real victory wasn't in the numbers or accolades. It was in the relationships she'd built along the way. Every listener who reached out to share their thoughts, every volunteer who showed up to lend a hand, every person who dared to speak their truth, they were the heartbeat of this movement. "I never set out to change the world," she wrote, in a heartfelt post marking the anniversary of her hiatus. "I just wanted to start conversations that mattered, but somewhere along the line those conversations turned into action, and that action turned into hope. And honestly, I couldn't be prouder of what we've built together." As she closed her laptop and stepped outside, the sun setting in hues of orange and pink, Karoline smiled softly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, and new opportunities to inspire change. But for now, she allowed herself to savor the moment, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones we discover when we stop long enough to listen.